Hi, I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. In recent years, American society has experienced a serious upsurge of anti-government rhetoric, including threats of violence against members of Congress, and in January 2011, an actual shooting. We've seen a continuation of war, torture, and human rights abuses, cutbacks in vital social and health services. We've seen a mania for privatizing public services. We've seen intolerance of minority races and religions, and an overall breakdown in the sense of our common humanity. Are these things interconnected? Do they have common roots? Can we find solutions that will resolve these problems and restore our public ethics and our common humanity? How can we reduce fear and violence and build a society that is secure and nonviolent? During this hour, we will explore these problems and we'll explore positive solutions. I'm happy to welcome two guests who will share their insights and their recommendations. Both guests are people I've known and respected for a good number of years, and I've always enjoyed working with them. It's a real delight to have on the program Larry Kerschner and Becky Liebman. Welcome. Good to have you here.
Thanks, Glenn.
They have rich backgrounds on a range of topics, and we will explore a range of topics and reconnect and meander through these things, and I think it'll be interesting and fruitful. Let's start with some aspect of privatization. The program, we want to explore the common good. It's in the title of this episode. In recent years, we've seen a shift away from the common good to a mania for privatizing a lot of aspects of public life. Instead of improving and supporting public schools, some people want to take money away from public schools and fund private charter schools. We've seen some states that have privatized their prisons, so instead of having state employees do it, who are well-trained and adequately paid with decent health care and food, they've privatized them, and then the companies that run those prisons cut food quality, cut health care, and pay cheap wages to poorly trained prison guards. And even the U.S. military is contracting out some functions that U.S. troops have performed, and they've had organizations or corporations like Blackwater do them, even though they charge more than having the troops do it. But it's this mania that says we've got to take money out of the government and fund private things instead. So I wonder, can you offer some insights into this mania for privatization versus a commitment to the common good?
A lot of it's based on the idea that somehow business through the market forces are better qualified to provide these kinds of services. But in fact, I mean, we can show lots of incidences where that in fact is not true, that the government run programs are much more efficient. If you look at healthcare, Medicare and the VA system have an overhead cost to run the programs of about 3%, whereas the private insurance companies in this country have an overhead in the neighborhood of 30%. And that 30% overhead, were it being run through a government sponsored program like Medicare for Everyone, could cover the 50 million people in this country who aren't currently have no insurance at no extra cost. So there are plenty of incidences where we can show that collectively through our representative government, we can do things more efficiently than the market because we don't require a profit.
There's an example that comes to mind about, again, public good versus the private. It's been shown very clearly that if we want to conserve energy and meet our transportation needs, rail is by far the most efficient way to move people around, and yet we've been starving passenger rail services for decades. The railroads back in the 60s were not making any profits on passenger rail. They were making their money from freight, and so they were just really doing a bad job of providing passenger rail. So Nixon and others created Amtrak, which is sort of a public-private kind of thing, but it's always been starved. And light rail for urban transportation makes more sense. The subsidies go into airports, and which are inefficient in terms of travel for energy, and the private automobile, which we know is horrendous. And so the subsidies get messed instead of looking at what's good for our own energy conservation as a whole nation.
Frustrating.
I think that if you look at what China is doing right now, where they're putting their money is in the light rail and the rail systems in their country, because they realize that if you've got a 1.3 billion people to move, that's an efficient way to do it.
Yeah.
And they were able to learn from our mistakes and just skip over that supposed bit of progress.
Yeah, and then there's one other thing that comes to mind. It's the nuclear power is horribly inefficient at producing energy, and if it were left to the market, it wouldn't work. So the government says, well, we'll exempt you from liability, and private insurers will not insure you against a nuclear accident. So the homeowner or the individual citizen is just stuck with a liability, and the nuclear power plant is subsidized in that way by not having to have. So again, it's a benefit for the private profit rather than the public good. And you look at the elections now, where the U.S. Supreme Court decided in January of 2010 that giant corporations can just go ahead and buy elections. They can give as much as they want to election campaigns. And that clearly is a violation of the public good, but it's for private benefit. And you just keep seeing these things all over. The day before we taped this program, I happened to be downtown, and I saw an employee in a local business sweeping the doorstep, the entryway to their small business. And if I were doing it, sweeping the litter, the dead leaves and the litter and whatever, if I were doing it, I would have swept them up, got a dustpan, and then brought it in and put it in the company's garbage can. Instead, this employee, she just swept the stuff out and just left it on the public sidewalk that we all share. And I thought, this is kind of a metaphor for the program that we're producing now.
Sounds exactly like it.
And
yes.
we see that kind of thing where the waste gets dumped out at the public inconvenience. And for the selfish benefit of the business that just doesn't want to do any accountability to the public. Are there ways, just general principles that you can think of that may help us sort out how to do public and private relationships?
Well, I think one of the things the market forces, they base a lot of what they say on Adam Smith and his theories of economics. And what a lot of them neglect is that the basis for Adam Smith's whole theories of economics, there was a moral basis for it. And there seems to be no moral ethic other than profit involved in the privatization efforts that we see today. The idea of common good isn't considered a value to deal to, it shouldn't enter in because it doesn't show a bottom line profit. But if they were truly following the dictates of Adam Smith, that would be entered into the overall progress. The idea that there is a moral aspect to it that they're ignoring.
And the conversation becomes very encumbered right now because there's a very visceral reaction, anti-government reaction in the land, or anti-government feeling in the land. And so to your question, Glenn, is there a way that this could begin to, that we could back up and take another look? It would be wonderful if it would begin to sink into the public consciousness just what government does do for us. We take these services so for granted. But for example, folks have pointed out, I set my alarm clock at 6:30. I hear the radio station, and I can hear the stations because the FCC has made it so stations won't overlap. I go to my faucet to make my coffee. My water is potable because the government has provided for that. I flick on my switch to make the coffee, and my house doesn't burn down from an electrical short because an electrician that was monitored by government did good work. And in the Pacific Northwest, I'm the beneficiary of hydroelectric power that was government subsidized. I get in my car and you see where this is going. I'll just rattle off a couple more, but stop at a stop sign or stoplight, which has been engineered for my safety thanks to government. I go through my day, I'm able to walk on the sidewalk without a bunch of dog poop because government has figured out, let's get the dog poop, or I go for a run in a city park to relax. So I think if people could begin to just have some honest recognition of the extent to which we are able to lead our lives because of government. Yeah. And it can be a little misleading in that oftentimes in our world, we pay money for something. I pay money for my groceries, I get my groceries. In terms of paying for government services, we pay, but we don't get that tangible thing immediately. So it's easy to discount that.
Yeah, you don't pay it right there. You know, the sales tax is sort of identified with whatever it is that you bought, or your property taxes if you're a homeowner. Those get collected twice a year, but you don't see it directly as going into that stoplight that kept you safe, or the National Weather Service that told you a storm was coming.
Exactly.
You know, because we're not doing a direct fee for service for each of those things.
Exactly.
It's done in a smoother, more efficient way, so you don't need to mess with it. You don't need to pay a nickel every time you go another block on the city street. Well, here's the toll booth for the next block. Here's the toll booth for the next block. You know, it's hidden.
I think the people that are provoking the anger against the government don't want to talk about those kind of things. I think a lot of the anger in this country came about or coalesced around when the government bailed out the banks and all of the people were losing their houses. It's a clear example of the people on the top benefiting at the expense of the people on the bottom. And I think a lot of the anger came out of that. And then the politicians who see it to their benefit to stoke that anger, they've added on other things, healthcare and through good propaganda. But I think there was a legitimate anger among the people that was there to begin with that has been used by those politicians.
Yeah, and we'll look at some of this, some of these things that are legitimate reasons for anger or legitimate reasons for fear. I mean, some of that is legitimate and cuts across the whole political spectrum. And I think it's helpful to sort out which of these things are valid versus which are not valid.
Exactly.
And what are the real problems and what are the real remedies. And to lump everything together simplistically is unhealthy. I'm aware of this quotation from Grover Norquist, who works with a very conservative anti-tax organization in Washington, D.C., and he was famously quoted as saying, "My goal is to cut government in half in 25 years to get it down to the size where we can drown it in a bathtub." Well, so when he does that, then what happens if your house catches on fire? There's no fire department.
Right.
You know, if you come to that intersection, there's no stop sign.
You're going to go for the lowest bid for the fire departments,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
private fire departments?
That's right, yeah. And I think that the anti-tax rhetoric is very simplistic, but sorting out the legitimate reasons for concern,
Yeah.
we need to do that, and we'll do that on the program here. And then some parts of the government are good, and then there are some parts that are abusive.
Exactly,
There are parts
exactly.
of the government that are torturing people.
This government is corrupt in a lot of ways. There's 26 lobbyists in Washington, D.C. for every member of Congress.
Yeah.
I mean, how can the little person compete against that?
And the health care legislation that went through the Senate was actually drafted by somebody who was high up in an insurance company. They drafted it for Senator Max Baucus from Montana, who was running the Senate Finance Committee.
Right.
And there's good reason to be concerned when the health insurance company, Big Shot, is drafting the health insurance legislation.
Yeah.
And so we want to, that stuff needs to get sorted out too. There's some good parts of the bill, but there are some really bad parts of the bill. So we need to sort this out. But it's helpful in doing better quality thinking. And George Lakoff, who's done this really good thinking and work about framing and reframing issues, it would be helpful to use his insights to help people sort out what's working. You've talked about taxes. Here's another thing that people rant
Well,
about.
yes, in terms of framing, I enjoyed the quote by Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, "I like paying taxes. With them, I buy civilization."
Right. Yeah.
And I believe there's a lot of truth to that.
That's right. I mean, that's the dues that we pay for living in a civilized society, and yet they talk about the, quote, tax burden. And when they frame it that way, well, tax burden, well, that's a weight that's holding you down. And they talk about tax relief, which means you've been burdened and now you're going to be set free. Well, that frames the debate in a way that goes against these valid notions of government that we were talking about. So why can't we talk about taxes in the ways that you said? What else do we have that would help our thinking about
Well, I think
taxes?
one of the problems is thinking. People in this country are not educated. I read something recently that said that 37% of college graduates in this country don't know how to do critical analysis. These are college graduates. Almost 50% of high school graduates don't know how to do critical analysis. So when people who are living in a state of anxiety, they see things kind of bad around. 100 million people in this country have a poorer financial condition than their parents did. When they see that kind of thing around them, they believe what they're told about the reasons for it instead of getting information and thinking a clear analysis of it. They just believe what they're told.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the problem is they don't think about it. And I think that's, to a large part, what we need to do is educate people and get people thinking, not correctly, but thinking, period.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and part of the way to do that, I believe, is to not feel like we have to have the answers all the time.
No,
and
we
not
don't.
Feel,
We don't have the answers.
yeah.
I think getting people to think about it, the answers will develop out of the people.
Right. But I just wanted to weave in here. My mother, who's 89, said to me the other day, "I think we need to practice saying, I don't know." And she said, she who walks with a walker, she said, I practice that in my bathroom mirror. I look in my bathroom mirror and I try all the different ways I can say, I don't know. I don't know. Ooh, I don't know. It would ratchet things down because I do it myself if I'm on thin ice, if I don't know my facts and figures, but I might cling to my assertion, even if it's not girded, and I might cling to it with some fierceness. But if I lived in a culture where it was more easily accepted for me to say, boy, I don't know.
I'm a retired family nurse practitioner, and I used to tell my patients that the advantage I had over physicians was I could say I don't know.
Yeah. I think one of the ways that helps also is if we can help people get back to our values. If we go back to, okay, let's, I value fairness. So I might not know the technical answer, but I know my root values include fairness. And so can we devise a solution that will be fair to everybody? So like on taxes, part of the thing that people are angry about is some people don't pay their fair share. Rich people in our society and big corporations do not pay their fair share. Many of the big corporations pay absolutely zero taxes, and some of them pay zero taxes, and they've got enough tax credits, they actually get money paid back to them so that ordinary middle class and working class and poor people are subsidizing multi-billion-dollar corporations. And people know that's not fair. So let's get back to issues of fairness and talk about what would be fair, So wouldn't that be a good conversation to have when people are concerned about taxes?
If you look,
I'll bet we would find a lot of common ground.
you're right. If we look at the tax structure post-World War II, there was about a 30-year period there in which the middle class in this country grew at its fastest rate.
Right.
The tax was progressive. The people who made a lot paid a lot.
Yeah.
When it got to Ronald Reagan, who said government is the problem, and the tax rate started going down, that's when the deficit started going up in a lot of these things. But if we had a true progressive income tax in this country, and we were not wasting our treasure on imperialist militarism, we have all the wealth in this country we need. It's just a matter of priority to answer the questions.
Yeah. And on your issue of wealth, I believe that the people who have made the most money off our system have the greatest responsibility to pay for the system that made them rich.
That's the moral part that Adam Smith talked about.
So I would, if I were having a conversation with somebody with a different political label than I might have, I'd get down to the issue of values and talk about fairness and that sense of proportionality.
Yeah. I mean,
So I think we can do that.
It's not a complex question when you talk about things like fairness and equal treatment and respect for one another. I mean, those are not difficult things to figure out.
On this program, we want to talk about the common good, and one, I think, essential step toward achieving the common good would be to help people develop some sense of empathy. I think part of that is what's lacking in our society, where people think only of themselves. I'm not saying everybody, but there's a tendency in the society to, like in the 1980s when it was like looking out for number one, I have to make me big at your expense.
Right.
And if we could cultivate empathy so I could recognize, we share a common humanity, and I need to make sure that you get your needs met and I get my needs met, and then we can all thrive together.
And people all over the world think about this and talk about this, and I'm reminded of the concept of Ubuntu, which is a word from the Bantu language, and it's a philosophy that's recognized in many, many cultures in the southern part of Africa. And basically it means my humanity is bound with your humanity. And not only is this something that's kind of lived and breathed in some cultures, or the philosophy of it, whether or not it's embodied all the time, people are people, right? But it is somewhat codified in the new South African Constitution. It is, there's a whole Linux operating system called Ubuntu. The Boston Celtics chant Ubuntu when they come out of their huddle because they believe that they're building some kind of, our humanity is hooked up with each other's, our playing is hooked up with each other. So it's something that is in the human heart. It's under this human skin. Many people have come to this same draw that this is there, and we believe it.
Yeah, when you told me about that, I researched some, and I found that it appears in many of the languages in the southern part of Africa, the same concept, and it might be spelled a bit differently or pronounced a bit differently, but it's defined. And Nelson Mandela has talked about it, and Desmond Tutu has talked about it, and I mean, the notion that says if I'm going to really be a real person, I have to make sure that you're fulfilled as a person as well, and that the whole community. I mean, it's sort of the roots of that saying that it says it takes a village to raise a child.
I think it goes along with, if you look at what Jesus and Martin Luther King both said, the way you judge a society is how you treat the
Yeah.
least
Yes.
among you.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
the poor people in this country, how do we treat them?
Yeah.
And that's how American society should be judged. And if we're not treating the least among us well, which we're not, we need to look at why we are the way we are.
And it has some implications. When you and I were preparing for the phone, you mentioned a doctor who's in Seattle, actually, he teaches in Seattle, and he has done extensive research showing that the health of a whole society is harmed when there's inequality. And so here's a graph showing like the top 30 countries in the world in terms of life expectancy, and Japan here at the highest, above 82 years, has the highest life expectancy, and the United States is now 29th. We're behind Cuba and behind a bunch of other countries. And this doctor said it's not because like we have such a good healthcare system. We have the most expensive healthcare system in the world, and in Japan they have a very high rate of smoking, but the United States has a much higher rate of death by lung cancer partly because our healthcare system is focused on profit instead of on health, and partly because we have such a gap, and this is his main point, is there's this gap between the rich and the poor. There's also this graph, which I don't expect you to read, but I just want to show the main features. This is the gap between the top 1/100th of 1% of U.S. families in relation to the average income of the bottom 90% of U.S. families. So you'll see a gigantic peak right here, and that was in the late 20s, right before the stock market crash and the Great Depression. And you'll see over here that we are reaching these kinds of peaks again now in our economy, where there's this enormous disparity between the very, very rich and everybody else. And we're seeing that where that has actual effects in terms of life expectancy from the first graph. And other indicators, this same doctor has done.
Stephen Bajruka.
Yeah, he's taken a number of indicators of life expectancy and infant mortality and various kinds of health indicators, and the composite ranking of all those versus income disparity on a nation-by-nation basis is just striking. And the United States has horrible income disparities compared to other countries, and we have really horrible health statistics compared to other countries.
Don't we have the largest disparity now of any country in the world?
At least of any
the major countries,
of any of the well-to-do countries.
Right,
yeah. And we have all these horrible social problems, and it's because of that we think about my wealth and to heck with you, you know. And so I want to pick up a related theme about sort of the common good and thing. There was something you had mentioned on the phone, Larry, and public space. You know, a society. You think of the old Greek agora, the old Greek marketplace, where people would gather and talk politics and talk philosophy, and it's a meeting place. And we have a kind of a shortage of public space where people can gather and have human-to-human interaction.
Right. You can see a few small spaces like Traditions Cafe in Olympia. But if you're looking at a space for more than 50 people, it's difficult to find that. And what came to mind when we were talking was the weekend before, the Seahawks had a playoff game in Seattle where, I don't know, there were 60,000 people in a public space, and that was for profit. They probably didn't have to get a license to have those 60,000 people there. But when WTO went on in 1999, there were probably all kinds of licenses that were required and probably ignored to some extent by the people. But there were
tear gassing of innocent
people. And there were 40,000 people there who, when they didn't do what they were expected to do, were tear gassed and clubbed. And so the little bit of of public space that's there, the powers that be want to regulate closely.
Right. Well, and a lot of the public space that people have now where people gather are at malls and
Right.
other private places.
And
That's
you
private
can't-
property and they'll
you
kick you
can't-
out. You don't
yeah.
have a First Amendment
Yeah,
right.
you don't. There's no-
Constitution is suspended
Exactly.
in malls. So where do you have,
You know, it's not there for people, but it's there for the corporations.
Oh, yeah.
They have all the First Amendment right they want,
well, and after
or they can buy.
Yeah, after the January 2010 Supreme Court ruling in Citizens United,
Right.
this right-wing court said that they can spend as much as they want on election campaigns, and so that's again an abuse of the private versus what should be the public good.
Right, and the illogic of that obviously is that they consider corporations to be persons, and there's some movement among people to have persons defined as a naturally born
Yeah,
person.
yeah, an actual human being,
So
yeah.
an actual human being, and thus corporations would not have
Right,
those rights. And
There's something we touched upon a few minutes back having to do with people's angers and fears and stuff, and the wealth and non-wealth that we experience. And I know that in the United States, income levels in terms of real dollars, when you factor out inflation, peaked in about 1976 or 1977, depending on which data you look at. And people know that and you had mentioned that like 100 million people are less well off
Right.
financially than their parents were. People know that they're on this slide downward, and whether they articulate it with numerical research or whether it's a gut feel that says we're going the wrong way, you see more and more public opinion polls where larger portions of the public say our country's headed in the wrong direction. And people know that a lot of indicators are getting worse in terms of some environmental things and sprawl of, economic.
There was a Rasmussen poll that came out late last year. It said that only 36% of the people in this country expect that it's going to get better in the future. I mean, that's a
Wow.
staggering number.
So what that does then is if you're feeling kind of hemmed in and you're on this downward slide, you go into this defensive mode and you go, I want to take care of me and my family,
Exactly.
and we're going to jettison you and your family.
Right.
And so you get this polarization of us versus them, and the bitterness about, well, my race or my religion or my whatever versus yours. And so you can understand people's fears, but the danger is when they get exploited by somebody who
Exactly.
says,
Right.
you should be afraid of those people of the different
Exactly.
race or the
Exactly.
different religion
Exactly.
or whatever. And that's what's, I see that's what's happening, is people with those racist or bigoted agendas are exploiting
Right.
what are in some cases very natural fears. Let's look at the real reasons why
Right.
we're having economic problems. Let's look at the real reasons why we're having environmental problems and go after those.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the whole anti-immigrant movement
Yeah.
is a prime example of
Yeah.
that. They're afraid that these immigrants are going to come and take our jobs and are going to work for less money, but in fact, the corporations have already moved those jobs offshore.
Yeah, nobody
for
has those
people who
jobs.
work for
Yeah.
25 cents an hour.
Right, right.
So but these people who are anti-immigrant are being controlled by that hate and that fear.
Right, right.
So
So, given all that we've said thus far about our concern for the common good and what some of the pitfalls are in trying to get there because of obstacles and things, let's look a bit differently at the other half of the program title here. This program's title is The Nonviolent Society for the Common Good. So let's look at issues of violence and nonviolence. Some of the things that we've talked about are construed by thoughtful folks as institutional violence or systemic violence. When you have an unjust economic system, that's doing violence to those on the bottom. If you're abusing the environment, you're doing violence to the environment to the people who need that water or air or whatever. So let's look at some of these systemic or institutional things. Do you have other insights about violence or nonviolence that we should be sharing at this point? And then we'll get into.
Well, the whole prison industrial system is a prime example of that. If you look at there's 2.25, 2.5 million people in prison in this country, which is 25% of all the people in the whole world who are in prison. And more than 50% of them have skin black or brown in a country where they only make up about 15% of the population. So that tells you that the people of color and the poor people are the ones that are in the prison. You know, it's a prime example of the injustice of the system, which is a form of violence against poor people in this country.
There's this notion that we see in movies, and we see it in our foreign policy as well. In movies, a Western or a crime movie or a spy movie, you get right up toward the end of the film, and there's a big shootout, and that shootout just resolves all the problems.
Yep.
And so all those problems are resolved because of that big shootout right before the movie ends, and then it can end on a happy note. And this has been referred to as the myth of redemptive violence,
Right.
that violence can solve the problems and redeem us from them. And this is pretty much embedded in our culture, and we play this out in our foreign policy. So that if we have a conflict with some other nation, the remedy is, well, let's go bomb them. Let's do this or that or whatever kinds of things. And there's this old saying that says you have to fight fire with fire, but that doesn't work. You got to fight fire with water.
Exactly.
And we don't do that. And so we see that played out. And I think that's worth mentioning in this context, that we have to change that whole paradigm. We have to change that whole model of how we see the world.
It's clear that violent solutions to problems create violent problems that then need to be dealt with again.
Right.
Whereas, because in a violent solution to a problem, you've got someone who's going to be angry, whatever it is. There's going to be an angry person, and that person will have learned to resort to violence because from their problem.
Yeah.
Whereas if you solve problems nonviolently, there's not that angry person there
Right.
to continue that flood of violence.
Well, Becky, as part of the solution, you do a lot of volunteer work with the Dispute Resolution Center of Thurston County, and the whole
Right.
notion of conflict mediation
Right.
is a way to get out of that and do a different model where people are empowered.
It is such a hopeful field. It's really a relatively young field, the field of alternative conflict resolution. I would say it's 30 or 40 years old, and one way that it manifests here locally is through our local dispute resolution center, and that is very much a case of both the earlier part of this, the theme of the earlier part of this program and what we're talking about now, in that it is a blatant situation where others can help, where the community can help individuals resolve their conflicts, where the community, as represented by a couple of very highly trained volunteer mediators, can help individuals in conflict, which is so normal. It's a completely normal part of our world, but when you're in it, you don't know how to get out of it. And so this is definitely an example of where the community represents the public good, being able to help the individual grow and thrive.
Well, I like it so much because it actually empowers people to practice empowerment, and having been through that, then people can say, oh, okay, well, I have some new sense of how to move towards solutions, or it's like practicing democracy. We don't all have to have the same. Well, in a democracy, you don't have to have the same political viewpoints.
Not at all.
But if somebody has a different political viewpoint, you don't beat the crap out of them.
Right.
You interact and you work it through. And Gandhi always believed that everybody has a part of the truth, and you bring it together. And certainly in the mediation process.
There's many truths, and yes, this happens to be one approach of dozens and dozens of approaches to conflict resolution, but it presupposes that people don't like each other, they don't trust each other, they don't want to be in the same room with each other, but through a very pretty common sense blending of, I call it communication 101 and psychology 101, really, a little formula, a little approach, a little set of tools can truly help people walk out of the room with some solutions, their own solutions.
Right, yeah, yes, and they have a much higher rate of compliance, as I understand, than something that's imposed by a court, because the people have worked this out themselves.
Yeah.
Well, they've been empowered to solve their problems. What a concept.
Yeah.
This is what we need in a democracy.
Yeah.
And what if we collectively use that formula for our foreign policy?
Wouldn't that be a switch? It's a whole different model than bombing the crap out of somebody.
The government is sometime in the near future going to start talks with Iran again.
Yeah.
And we've basically threatened them with violence if they don't agree to every demand.
Yeah. You have to do what we say or we'll beat the crap out of you.
Exactly. What if we went and found common agreements, and because surely there are things that we agree on. Well, and if that was the entree.
Right.
And it takes a finessed process, like a rudimentary nutshell description of conflict resolution is, let's say there's two people and they both need an orange.
Oh, yes.
And so if we had to compromise, if we're not going to bomb one person or another, we had to compromise, okay, let's cut the orange in half. But it turns out that was still unsatisfying to each party, because one party needed the juice of an orange, and a whole orange, and one party needed the peel of a whole orange.
They're going to be making bread and this orange peel in the ingredient.
But you wouldn't know that unless you were able to just kind of get in there and be able to, what the needs are and the interests.
And we've been through, in the previous administration in this country, this unilateral thing where we would just deliberately snub the United Nations and deliberately violate international law and say, no, we're going to just do it our way, and with contempt and violate the Kyoto protocols for the climate and all that stuff.
It's embarrassing.
And we gotta turn these things around, because the rest of the world knows that that's just bullying. It's just bullying, and that doesn't get respect. And when people have been bullied, they're going to want to get back at the bully in one way or another. And we're seeing other countries that are wanting to get back at the United States. And I think we need to understand it. So it's like when we were talking about the anger that people in this country have if they've been ripped off by an unfair tax system, or they've been snubbed by politicians that don't represent them because they've been bought by a higher power, a higher financial power. I don't mean that. But we see that in the first half of the program, where there are reasons for anger and there are reasons for this, and we see this in the international sphere too. And we've got to work together.
It doesn't take
have the
a
global
genius
common
to
good.
recognize that words and actions have implications. It shouldn't be that hard to figure it out.
I want to show something here that sort of illustrates this, and I realize the viewers won't be able to read the fine print, but we have this notion of national security, and we usually think of this as we got to have the most weapons and be willing to use them and bomb people and bully them and ignore international law and do things our way and demand on getting our way. And that's sort of the usual, typical American way of getting national security. And it's based on domination. Each row here is a different aspect of this, where it's based on domination, and we blame an axis of evil. Bush identified Iraq, Iran, and North Korea as an axis of evil, even though they're not the least bit allies. The other column off on the right side is a better way to really get true security. If we really want to be secure, instead of trying to dominate, we would cooperate and make friends with other countries and collaborate, work together for common solutions. Martin Luther King never called any person evil, like Bush named this axis of evil. Martin Luther King identified three evils that were not persons. He identified racism, militarism, and poverty as things that we have to fight against.
Exactly.
Well, that's a whole different thing from blaming people. And then the goals, instead of national security against other nations, would be global security with other nations, so that we're all sharing this Ubuntu concept. We can only be secure when we make other countries secure and respect their integrity. And so it's just a whole different model,
Right.
and it plays down the page in
Well,
that
what
way.
would the world be like if the $17 trillion we spent on nuclear weapons had been used to give clean water to everybody on the earth?
And I've seen breakouts of how much we spend on militarism and how little it would cost to like provide clean drinking water for everybody on the planet and take care of the desert creating droughts that are happening across some areas.
It's just a matter of priorities.
And but it comes from this selfishness, and we just need to get beyond that. I remember Martin Luther King had said, "A true revolution of values will lay hand on the world order and say about war, this way of settling differences is not just. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." And you can just see what's happening to our country, the kinds of problems we're talking about, when we keep going down that divisive path instead of this. Are there, let's see, I want to get on to this next thing here. You've done some really clever and varied work that I keep, when we're talking about the topics to prepare for the program, it seemed like a lot of these were about empowering people and depolarizing. We've talked a lot about the polarization. And you've done a lot of things that bring together people in various ways, including music. Tell us some of
thank
those
you.
fresh ways.
Well, I just feel very deeply, very passionately that music and movement together in community is a very underutilized way to break down isolation and to very quickly find a common denominator. I'm in a community concert band, and I'm sure among the 55 of us, we represent the entire spectrum in terms of how we view the military, how we view religion, how we view politics, but we are there on the same page in the same measure, hopefully, with each other. And actually, I think it was just in our local paper, but it's been around for a while, that this understanding that it makes you happy. It makes you happy. And there's a lot of really fascinating speculation about how music and movement may have fit into human evolution and the evolution of communities. So that is not the most resoundingly political strategy to make the world a better place, but I think it is a worthy strategy.
I think it is political in the sense the original word, has to do with the populace, the polis, the people. And that works. I heard someone today talking about, after listening to Cornel West expound on some of these issues, and they said, after listening to him, that's another thing that's missing in our everyday language is poetry. People don't talk that way anymore. Everything is cut and dry. There's no passion along those lines.
Yeah, and you do great poetry. I've enjoyed a lot of your poetry, and I look forward to reading more. But so yeah, and one of the things that you do with the Artesian Rumble Orchestra is you come out and support the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation's vigil Friday 4:30 at Percival Landing downtown. You come out. We start the vigil at 4:30. The band comes out at 5. They play till 6, and we have a wonderful time. And it creates a festive thing. Well, our approach to working for peace is a positive approach. It's not this angry, blaming kind of thing, and it's a positive, the kind of attitude that we're conveying on the program here, and the music that you do is lively and fun, and passersby come by and they dance for a bit with it, and people bring their kids, and they, it's a nice thing. So it adds.
Well, you raise a really good point when you think of how will any of us who care about the things we've been talking today and who are in the game, who want to make a change, it would behoove us to look for how to make things fun. There's a national phenomenon right now called, in the exercise world, I'm not a big exerciser, but there's an exercise out there called Zumba, which is dancing, and their little motto is ditch the exercise, join the party. And I think, and it's really quite a commercial success as well, and it's getting people to move. So for us to be able to figure out what's the analog in our world of trying to do something.
Well, this reminds me of when in 1982, I worked with the Thurston, and you too worked on the Thurston County Nuclear Weapons Freeze campaign, and this is the time during Reagan's military buildup and the deployment of cruise and Pershing missiles, and just the world was just on the verge of blowing itself up, and we could have said, "Holy crap, we're going to blow ourselves up! This is horrible." We were serious about it, but the slogan for the campaign was, "Ain't it great to be alive?" And it just captured the kind of spirit we want to have, which was a positive thing. And we won the vote in November of 1982 with like 63% of the vote countywide to have the United States, to call upon the United States government to stop the production and deployment of nuclear weapons. Well, this is great.
Yeah.
But we did our efforts with that kind of spirit.
Right.
I was in Korea about 5 years ago and was involved in a couple of protest movement, and it was that way there. Every third person was waving a flag. There was music. There were people dancing around all the way across Seoul. And it was such a striking difference to so many of our protests here that are fairly somber. It's, Olympia FORs is unique in that sense, I think. More people should be copying what you're doing.
When we were preparing for the program, you mentioned also the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers, and they've been producing these wonderful short videos, and these kids have such heart and such a positive attitude, even though they're in just the most horrible circumstance in the middle of Afghanistan.
Most courageous kids. They're aged 13 to 20, 19 or 20.
Yeah.
They're living in the middle of this great war, and they're by their lives they're opposing the Taliban and the U.S.
Yeah, and they're calling upon people to
live peacefully.
Practice your best values. One of their things was, why not love?
Why not love?
Instead of looking at militarization and fighting, why not try practicing love as a way to solve the problem? This is coming from kids.
Yes.
And the diplomats can't figure that out, but they've been doing such wonderful stuff, and we've been kind of helping with them in some ways. We're doing a thing also of Bring the Billions Home campaign, Bring Our Billions Home, and you and I are both on the steering committee of that project through the Western Washington Fellowship of Reconciliation, and the Olympia FOR is very much involved.
Yeah, it's still somewhat developing, but the gist of it is to make people aware of the things that are not being done or that were done but are not now being done in their communities, basically because of lack of funds.
Right.
And I think what struck me was listening to the legislature trying to cut the state budget by $4 billion, and the Washington State taxpayers are spending about $4 billion a year to support the war. So it isn't as though we even need new money.
Yeah.
The money's already being spent. It's just, again, it's just the priority. Where's the money going?
Yeah.
It should be going to the things,
Yeah.
The foster programs and
the kids,
the libraries and all that stuff.
I mean,
that
library
they're being
hours
cut.
have been cut, and mass transit is cut.
Right. We're already paying
schools
the
and stuff.
money that should be supporting that. It's just going.
Right, and a lot, the state and local, I was talking with a mayor of a local community, I won't say which one, just 3 days ago, and mentioned this to that mayor, and that mayor really got it. I mean, because state and local governments have been cut from a lot of federal funding they used to get. I know there are some good websites available. I want to just put in a plug for people can find out about the Bring Our Billions Home campaign through the Western Washington FOR website, which is www.for.org. They can also do it through the Olympia FOR website, which is olympiafor.org, and then there's some more lettering that goes on beyond that. You had earlier talked about this fresh approach to government is good, and there's actually a website called governmentisgood.com. I've read a bunch of those articles, and they're very good. Doesn't mean everything government does is good, and that guy actually has an article on there that says the main problem we have with government is that it's not democratic enough, small d democratic. It's too much run by the special interests and for the benefit of the special interests. That's what we need to fix rather than slam government altogether. Exactly. And very smart articles on there. I recommend that. And for people who want to talk with others, the website publicconversations.org helps people carry on thoughtful, humane, respectful conversations about controversial issues at the local level, face to face. And I recommend that. There's also good information about nonviolence and grassroots organizing to solve problems at the Olympia FOR website. You can visit olympiafor.org and then click on the nonviolence. It has a range of information there that's good. What would you like to see people do about the things that we've been discussing?
I would like people to look at what is working in terms of what some of the government services are that they're receiving, to appreciate that. It sounds so humble, doesn't it? And I would also like all of us to practice saying, I don't know.
I'm personally convinced that the U.S. Military empire is going to collapse within the next 10 years the same way the Soviet empire collapsed. But if that happens, the United States will still be here. And if we look at the history of the United States, there have been people-led movements, the union movements, the farmers, the women's suffragettes, the civil rights movement. We have that potential in America to create a space for everyone to live. So I think people need to have hope. They need to educate themselves about what's the potentials and what's going on. Okay. They need to learn how to think about what they're told.
Wow, good. Can we get another brief closing thought from each of you? We'll squeeze that in and then wrap this thing up. And don't say I don't know. I know you have a wealth of wisdom.
I will just say thank you for organizing this, and thank you for people who are watching this and who are considering these ideas.
Yeah, it'll be fun to anticipate what people may do as a result of this. And
yeah, I think we need to develop the kind of community that Martin Luther King talked about, the beloved community, in which we treat each other with respect, when we realize that there's no reason to think that you are any better or any worse than anyone else.
Right. Well, I want to thank Larry Kerschner and Becky Liebman. I'm happy that we were able to get both of you on this program. I want to thank all the folks who've been watching. On April 4th, 1967, Martin Luther King gave a powerful speech at Riverside Church in New York City, and he critiqued the Vietnam War, and he put it in the larger context of the civil rights movement, which was being robbed of the money that was needed to solve issues of poverty because the money was going to the war. And he was connecting the dots. And some people were upset that he was connecting those dots. But he had a pretty good critique of U.S. foreign policy and what needed to get done. He said, I'm convinced that if we were to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will lay hand on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. So I think we need to look at the rest of his speech. You can find it on the internet. And practice your best values and your best wisdom at the local level and help it reach out from there. So that would be an interesting way to proceed. See if we can get beyond this us versus them world, because we really are all in this together. You can get information about a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolence from the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 491-9093 or www.olympiafor.org. We're all one human family. We all share one planet. We can make the world a better place, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs you. Thanks.